Alright, hello and welcome to another home learning lesson. Today we're looking at the control over the workforce and the different policies the Nazis would put in place to be able to control their workforce rather than just manage them. Our learning objective today is to look at how Hitler could take control over the German workforce, and we're going to think back to what we know about invisible unemployment from our lesson all about the control over the economy. The big question for us is to figure out, why did Hitler want to use this invisible unemployment? And reason being is he was looking to appear more favorable in the eyes of his allies as well as the eyes of his enemies, such as Britain, France, and America. Hitler wanted to appear on the surface to be someone who was solving the problems within Germany and not someone who was trying to wage yet another war. So when we look at this image here, this is a picture of German people at work, and it's showing those really distinct gender roles. Men have the job to, of course, join the military, and women have the job to work in the factories and on the home front. But if we're focusing on invisible unemployment, we know that this poster is quite inaccurate. And we know with invisible unemployment that women and Jews were not counted in employment statistics. Now, because of this, it made things look as though there were more people who actually had those jobs. And again, if you're unsure of this, just look back to the previous YouTube video and you can have a quick refresher on invisible unemployment. The next thing we're going to look at is this car, which is quite an iconic looking vehicle. This, of course, is the Volkswagen Beetle, something we're going to discuss a little bit more in our lesson, the role that Volkswagen played within Nazi Germany, as well as the role of this specific car. We've got two keywords to look at. First and foremost is the KDF, and this is what we would call strength through joy as an English translation. And this was an organization set up to improve the lives of workers and to keep them happy. Hitler was extremely concerned that if my workforce decides to strike, I'm not going to have the factory production that I need, and we're going to fall back into an economic depression. The RAD is also known as the National Labor Service. This was very similar to what we've learned about in America with the New Deal and the alphabet agencies. So this was an opportunity for young men kind of aged 18 to 25. They would do some manual labor jobs for about 6 months. Now, the manual labor jobs were designed to be building physical strength and start with that introduction to military training, something that Hitler again knew that he would need in the coming years. So Hitler is Chancellor. He became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, but he had a few challenges. Now, underneath each heading, we need to figure out how Hitler would solve the particular problem. And the first big problem he's going to face is having support from the general public. We know that not everybody liked Hitler. Most people did, but not everyone. And there was a small group of young kids who were called the Edelweiss Pirates. And they were kind of like the 1930s version of a hippie. They had long hair, they didn't go to Hitler Youth, they tried to flaunt the rules and the curfews the Nazis would put in place. And Hitler needed to earn their support. So of course the question we're trying to answer is, how is this going to be possible? Well, the best way to get support from the public is through work schemes and making sure that people make money to support themselves. We've talked about this before. If you give a man a fish, he eats for one day, but if you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for the rest of his life. And Hitler didn't want to be giving things away to the public because they would be too reliant on he and his government. But they did decide if we provide them with work or a job, they can make their own money, they can pay their own rent, and they can buy their own food. Getting support from the Reichstag was a bit trickier. Instead of getting support, Hitler decided to take a different route. He got more Nazis in cabinet. Originally, he only had 2 out of 12 Nazis in cabinet. He increased that number drastically, and he drafted the Enabling Act. And this was a bill similar to Article 48 that allowed Hitler to do essentially whatever he wanted in the event of an emergency. Now, the Enabling Act didn't specify what an emergency actually is, but it did say that in the event of one, Hitler has the ability to make choices without asking the Reichstag for approval. And last, earning support from the army. Rome was Hitler's next biggest political rival, and Hitler did fear that Rome could take power away from him. We have talked about the Knight of the Long Knives, and we do know what happened to Rome. He was taken from his home, he was put in a prison cell, and subsequently he was shot by the SS. And this was Hitler's main plan on, again, eliminating all of those rivals. Anyone who can take power from Hitler either needs to be convinced to join the Nazis or to be completely eliminated. There's a few more changes that are going to take place within German society, and the Nazis made these major changes to try to exact more control specifically over the workforce. Now, the first one is looking at banning all of those, the National Labor Service is providing young men with manual labor jobs. Think of the AAA, think of the CCC, think of the TVA. These jobs in America during the Great Depression didn't require a whole lot of skill. They were jobs for young men to go into the wilderness, cut down some trees, dig a ditch, build a road. But it was getting people back to work and earning their own money, which was a big concern people had. Rearmament. This was done very secretly. The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany's military to 100,000 soldiers, no submarines, no warships, no tanks. And Hitler had to build up for future wars very quietly, and he did this behind the scenes. This also reduced unemployment. Of course, you need lots of people to build the tanks, but you need miners to actually get the metals from the earth to be able to build the tanks with. Controlling the workforce, this was to prevent strikes from happening. And one thing that Hitler did to stop the strikes was to ban all trade unions. Now, most jobs today, you're able to join a union, and they just look out for your best interest. They make sure that your work environment is safe, it's not too cold, it's not too hot, you're not working too many hours, and they lobby on your behalf to your employer to try to get the best rights for you. Hitler didn't want people going on strike and protesting when they were working in his war factories. So he decided to ban all trade unions. And this allowed Hitler to have a greater control over people's jobs. And the last one is the Volkswagen scheme. Now, Volkswagen, car manufacturer we're probably all aware of, it actually translates into people's, which is Volk, and Wagen is car. So this means the people's car. And this was a scheme designed to get everybody into a vehicle. For 5 marks each week, so about the equivalent of £5, over the course of 35 weeks, you could be the owner of a new Volkswagen vehicle. This was used to generate a bit more income to the government. The Volkswagen scheme was cancelled in 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War, and no vehicles were delivered. Now, you might think most people would be pretty angry about this, but they were too concerned with winning the Second World War to worry about the car that wasn't going to be delivered. Now, how did Hitler tackle unemployment? So here are the things, again, that he did. The National Labor Service, this made work compulsory for men between the ages of 18 and 25. And they had military training simultaneously as they were doing jobs. Public works such as building roads, hospitals, schools, houses, these were all things that Hitler knew Germany will need at some point or another. So why not use the Great Depression to his advantage? Why not make these buildings now so they can be used when the Depression is over? The knock-on effect of this is many people were actually given jobs, whether they were building or even managing some of these new institutions that were being created. Now, rearmament. This gave lots of people jobs by manufacturing military essentials. And sometimes we think of military essentials as guns, as tanks, as planes. But soldiers need clothing, they need food, they need maps. All of these things were being manufactured for the military. Oftentimes, clothing companies converted their factories from making, jumpers and trousers for school uniforms. They converted into making tunics and trousers for soldiers. Opponents of the Nazis, these were sent to concentration camps. Pretty self-explanatory. Anyone who stood up against the Nazis who was not willing to follow the rules, they would be sent away. And invisible unemployment, Jews were not being counted in unemployment statistics. Now, this made employment rates seem much higher than they were. This wasn't the case. Women were just not being counted as they were being considered fully employed as wives and mums, and Jews were not counted because they were not seen as humans. And again, if you need any extra help with invisible unemployment, just refer back to our previous lesson on the German economy. So going on with invisible unemployment, we've got two sources here. And the big question for us is to be able to explain what do these sources tell us about unemployment in Germany between 1933 and 1939. Now, we've got here in source E, we have 33 all the way up to 39, and we're showing the unemployment. And this is a pretty drastic fall. In 1933, we're quite comparable to America, having a significant amount of the population who is unemployed. But we've got this extremely steep decline in unemployment. So things are getting better in Germany. Now, why is this? Well, the same amount of people had the same amount of jobs between 1933 and 1939. But keeping in mind, this is an official Nazi government statistic. So we know that there are two groups who are not being counted in these stats, and that's going to be women and Jews. They're not going to be counted here. So all of these jobs that are being gained in this time period here, they're the jobs that were previously held by women and Jews. Source F says, under the Nazis, there has been much invisible unemployment. The number of unemployed Jews is great and is increasing, but those who are not counted as being unemployed. Another source of invisible unemployment has been the sacking of women from their jobs. None of these people are included among the employed in the official stats. Part-time workers are counted as fully employed. And this is an American journalist, something, again, we need to keep in mind of his perspective. He doesn't exactly have the interest of making Germany's employment figures look positive. So he's writing in an article called Work Under the Nazis, and this was published in April of 1936. So he's trying to get the truth out about what the Nazis are really doing with their employment stats. So it tells us two really important things. It tells us that the Nazis, they were very concerned with looking good, and they wanted it to appear as though they were solving the problems of the Great Depression to just boost their image globally. Let's not forget that it wasn't until 1926 that the Nazis were allowed to finally join in the League of Nations. And this was another point in the Nazis' favor, where they were looking as though they were improving lives of Germans. Source F does tell us that the Americans were a bit skeptical about the Germans' attempt to lower the unemployment rates. And when the Americans saw these statistics, they said there's no way this is possible, that within the span of 6 years, they're going from 6 million to just about 300,000 unemployed people. So they were quite critical of what they were doing. So looking at the jobs in Germany, this is just a mind map. I'd encourage you to put this on paper, and these are the ways that Hitler would look to create some more work for people in Germany. So the first we're going to look at is the job creation schemes, the RAD, and the DAF. Now we've got a picture. Again, this is a staged photo for a newspaper. We've got loads of leading Nazis in the background. They're all smiling. They're all so happy. And we've got this guy up front. You can just about see his nice mustache. And this is a photo for a newspaper where Hitler is breaking ground for the building of an Autobahn. And the Autobahns were a series of road networks built during the Great Depression. They're still used today. They're very famous in Germany for not having speed limits. You can drive as fast as you want on them. And they're multiple lanes. Some are 6, 7, 8 lanes wide. But this was a very simple thing to do. Roads are needed. You have to have them, and they don't take a lot of skill to actually develop. You need the engineers to make them and oversee them, but just about anybody can grab a shovel and get to work on a road. The KDF. If the video does work, you'll be able to see Donald Duck as an example of the KDF. He does go to work in a German munitions factory, and we can tell that Donald Duck does not enjoy his job in the slightest. Now, the KDF, Strength Through Joy, was set up to provide workers with rewards. So if you were really good at your job, you might get a holiday with your family, you might get an extra paid day off, or maybe they would provide you with a voucher for a nice meal. In our video, Donald Duck's holiday was a banner dropping down from the ceiling of some mountains that he enjoyed for a few seconds before being sent back to work. Rearmament. We have a shot here of a German tank factory. This was in 1938, so just in the year leading up to the war. We can see there are loads of tanks being produced. But this was not an exclusive event. We had German uniforms being produced, weapons, munitions, you name it. Everything was being produced en masse for the military to grow. Invisible unemployment. Although this did not create jobs, it provided the illusion that jobs were being filled by Germans. And the Volkswagen scheme. So this was again a public program set up to provide Germans with a new vehicle for a very affordable price. We're looking at 5 marks a week for about 35 weeks. At the end of that, you would have yourself a new vehicle. Now, by 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed and had suffered through more than 3 years of the Great Depression. And we've got to think to ourselves why the Nazis might have liked, or why people would have liked working for the Nazis. There's a few reasons why people would have actually liked this, and it had a lot to do with promises being kept by Hitler. We know that the Weimar government attempted to resolve the problems of the Great Depression, but they were largely unsuccessful. This did mean that Hitler had the ability to solve problems by actually providing solutions to people. So if you needed to have a job, well, you went to work in a munitions factory. If you needed a place to live, you could go on a housing scheme to get a new home or apartment to rent. Now, what caused the Nazis to offer these kind of jobs that other people could not? Well, the Nazis had a lot of friends in industry. And industry was growing in Germany in the 1935, 36, 37, mainly in developing the military. So other jobs could be offered to people who could work in these kind of war factories. And lastly, what would happen if young people did not want to work? And by young people, we mean those are between the ages of 18 and 25. For the most part, people did take jobs that they were offered. During the Great Depression, you were just thankful if you had somewhere to go to work and to get a paycheck. So very rarely would people turn down work offered by the Nazis. But if they refused to, they'd be what we call work shy. And they would then be sent to a forced labor camp or a political opponent's camp, similar to a concentration camp. That would be where they would spend a predetermined amount of time before they either came around to the Nazis' ways or they decided to stay in the camp long. We're going to have a look at some scenarios here. We're just going to have a look at our gentleman's face. He's going to tell us whether he's happy or sad, and you can get at home, you can try to figure out what his mood would be. So within months of taking power, Hitler set up the German Labor Front, which was run by Dr. Robert Lee. It put in place a number of different rules. So bosses would have to give workers a May Day bank holiday on full pay. So how do we think that workers are going to react to this? How would you feel if you got a full day's pay for not going to work? Well, clearly you'd be quite happy. But it's not all going to be smiles. Bosses could no longer sack workers on the spot. This was a big change because before Hitler and the RAD came in, you could lose a job at a moment's notice. And again, workers thought this was quite nice, that they needed some kind of formal warning if they were going to be terminated. Trade unions were abolished. Trade unions are set up again to protect the rights of workers. And if you could imagine, you're working in a factory and all the representatives who would work alongside the government to better off your working life, if they're removed, you're going to be quite frustrated because nobody's looking out for your rights anymore. Workers could not leave a job without the government's permission. Again, this is going to be quite frustrating for people. They would want to be able to change jobs or change employers, but you had to ask the government. If they said no, you were stuck in your current job. Workers could no longer bargain for higher wages. So sometimes in a job, you may wish to sit down with your boss, say, I've worked really hard for the last 6 months. My productivity is up. I think I deserve a raise. This was banned under the Nazis. You were paid what you were paid, and there was no negotiation over it. Strikes were made illegal. Sometimes we see people go on strike to try and prove a point that their working circumstances aren't good enough. And again, people are going to get frustrated by this because they feel the right to strike if need be. By the start of the Second World War, when the car factory was turned into a weapons factory, not a single VW had been made for a German customer. We're just going to refresh this and start off again. The KDF was also involved in a scheme called the Volkswagen Scheme. How do you think people felt when they were told for 5 marks a week you can have a new vehicle? Of course, they were quite happy. That's a very affordable price to pay over a very long period of time, and you won't even notice it coming out of your pocket. The price of a Beetle was equivalent to about 35's week wage, and again, if you set aside that 5 marks a week, you'd be able to get a new car. So again, people aren't too happy about losing a bit of their paycheck, but at the end of the day, they know getting a new car will be beneficial. By the start of the Second World War, the car factory was turned into a weapons factory, and yeah, people are going to be quite angry with the fact that they're not getting the vehicles that they had paid for. So how much do we remember about the Nazi ideas and policies concerning the workforce? So the KDF was responsible for organizing holidays for workers. The DAF was the abbreviation for the Beauty of Labor movement. The SDA was the abbreviation for the German Labor Front. The RAD was the abbreviation for the Reich Labor Service. Oops. The leader of the German Labor Front was Robert Lee. Of course he was. The Volkswagen translates into English as people's car. Arbeit macht frei translates into English as labor liberates. Arbeit macht frei was written on the front of a lot of concentration camps, and it loosely translates into work will set you free. The German word for people's community is Weltanschauung. Blut and Boden translates into blood and soil. And that was again a phrase used by the workers. And the last one, no worker in Nazi Germany ever received a Volkswagen. And we lost it here. But no cars were delivered.